The dropship vibrated as it pierced the thick cloud layer of Zaruka 9, its underbelly streaked with mud and ozone residue from the moon's dense atmosphere. Brittany Collins sat strapped into the side bench, her helmet resting in her lap, eyes locked on the grainy exterior feed showing a tangle of murky wetlands below. Giant fungal spires reached into the fog like swollen fingers. She could already see the steam rising off the surface, hot, damp, and probably full of organisms that hadn't evolved to be friendly. Across from her, a Sarnak cadet named Krex clutched his folded leg joints tighter with each jolt. His compound eyes darted from one screen to another, scanning the incomplete terrain data. Krex was used to relying on biology scanners and food synthesizers. Brittany could tell by his constant muttering that he was not prepared to eat anything that didn't come sealed in sterile gel. A flat voice crackled over the intercom. "Cadets, welcome to your Week 5 survival simulation. You have been selected to participate in Protocol 7. No technology nutritional acquisition. All food replicators, injectables, and scanners have been disabled. You will remain planetside for 7 full cycles. Your kits contain minimal tools. Find your own food. Stay alive!" Gasps echoed through the cabin. Brittany heard a shrill hum from the Drelna twins, bioluminescent sisters who had never even used cutlery, let alone dug for roots. One of the Hrelks let out a nervous clicking sound, followed by a thick cloud of stress vapor from his throat vents. Brittany took a deep breath. She had expected something like this eventually. The Academy's tests always escalated in difficulty. But to ban all forms of food tech? That was a whole different level. When the dropship touched down, the rear hatch slammed open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing a humid expanse of swamp and scattered vegetation. A suffocating wall of scent surged in, the smell of wet decay mixed with sweet pollen and something faintly acidic. Brittany stepped onto the muddy surface and instantly sank ankle-deep. Dozens of cadets followed, slipping, cursing, or flinching as their feet touched the unfamiliar terrain. The distribution drones hovered just long enough to drop the emergency kits, thin, dark pouches that looked laughably inadequate for a 7-day survival mission. Brittany took hers without complaint and stepped aside as the chaos began. Cadets rushed to open their packs, hoping for some hidden tech, some overlooked nutrient bar, some cheat code. There was none. Inside the kit, a carbon rope, a water condensation sheet, a dull metal scraper, 3 flint-like stones, a roll of biodegradable bandage, and a notepad stylus with only local storage. No maps, no guides, no energy cubes, nothing edible. Brittany crouched and unrolled the condensation sheet beside a shallow pool. She knew better than to drink from it directly. The oily rainbow shimmer on the surface was enough to suggest microbial death traps. Still, it was water, and water meant life could grow here. That was the first good sign. To her left, 2 feline-like cadets from the Shari species were arguing over whether the dark red leaves nearby were toxic. One of them reached for a stem, then hissed in pain as her fingers blistered. Brittany didn't need to intervene. Mistakes were already being made. On the far side of the clearing, Krex was trying to dig a hole to bury his waste, but the mud caved in and swallowed his digging tool. By midday, the entire group had split into nervous, frustrated factions. Some wandered deeper into the jungle-like growths to find food. Others stayed near the landing zone, afraid to touch anything. One cadet tried biting into a melon-sized blue fruit and ended up vomiting violet foam within minutes. Brittany quietly marked that plant on her notepad with a red cross. She moved methodically, examining the ground for insect trails. Where there were bugs, there might be edible protein. She didn't expect to find anything resembling Earth fauna, but the basics remained the same. Look for patterns, motion, nests. A cluster of burrows near the base of a thick vine structure drew her attention. The soil around it pulsed slightly, and she noticed faint chirping. With her scraper, she dug gently until a thick-bodied insect emerged. 6 legs, translucent wings, and a meaty abdomen. It twitched violently as she plucked it out with the bandage strip. She squinted at its mandibles. Sharp, but not venomous. Brittany sighed. She had eaten worse during Earth survival trials in the Australian outback. She bit into the rear section. The taste was bitter and nutty, like burnt walnuts with a hint of copper. Not exactly delicious, but not deadly. She made a note. High protein, possibly acidic. could be neutralized. Around her, the other cadets were failing. Someone tried fishing with the carbon rope. It snapped. Someone else boiled water using hot rocks. The container melted. Brittany stayed quiet, observing, listening. She found a root system with waxy vines and sliced one open. A thick gel oozed out. When it touched her skin, it didn't sting. She tasted a drop on her tongue and waited. No burning, no numbness. It was slightly sweet, maybe starchy. A few more minutes of chewing confirmed it could be broken down. Her gut accepted it. By evening, Brittany had a small collection of edible insects, 2 kinds of roots, and bitter fern-like leaves that made her tongue tingle but didn't make her sick. She didn't have fire yet, but she would figure that out later. The sun dipped low, casting an eerie glow across the swamp, and the fungal spires began to release luminescent spores into the air. She used her condensation sheet to build a partial lean-to and ate in silence, watching her fellow cadets curl up hungry, many still clutching empty kits. Krex approached her just before dark, his mandibles twitching. "You're eating?" he asked, voice uneven. "Yes," she replied. "Insects, some root paste, nothing special." He stared, uncertain whether to be impressed or disgusted. "You'll get sick." "I might," she said calmly, "but I'll also be awake tomorrow." Krex backed away slowly and disappeared into the shadows. Brittany leaned back against a tree trunk and closed her eyes, feeling the heat of the day still clinging to her skin. The air buzzed with unfamiliar chirps and clicks, but she wasn't afraid. She wasn't just surviving. She was beginning to understand this place, and unlike the others, she had no intention of waiting to be rescued. She would find a way to thrive, and maybe, if the rest stopped panicking, she would teach them how. By the second morning, the rising mist over Zaruka 9 gave the swamp an almost ethereal glow, as if the planet itself wanted to lull its visitors into a false sense of calm. Brittany's lean-to had held through the night, though her back ached from sleeping against a tangle of roots. As soon as the sky shifted from violet to gray, she stood, stretched her arms, and resumed her quiet patrol of the area. Her stomach rumbled, but she ignored it. She wasn't interested in temporary comfort. She needed a repeatable system, a method that worked. She stepped carefully through a cluster of slime-coated reeds and noted a new trail, broken stalks, scattered chitin fragments, and what looked like a chewed shell. Something large had passed here during the night. Not hostile, there were no drag marks, no blood, but active. That meant fresh movement and maybe another layer of food. She crouched low and spotted something glimmering beneath a wide-leafed plant. It was an insect, but not like the one from the day before. This one had a flatter body, almost translucent, and dozens of tiny legs pulsing rhythmically along its sides. Brittany approached slowly, watching its behavior. It wasn't aggressive. It fed on the black spores that had fallen from one of the fungal towers during the night. When she tapped the edge of the plant with her scraper, the creature shivered, but didn't flee. That was a good sign. She trapped it between 2 leaves and slipped it into her collection pouch, then stood and looked out over the landscape. Swamp to the west, dense vines to the east, and a tall ridge of jagged stone to the north that might hold dry areas or caves. She made a mental note to explore there later, but first, more protein. Using a broken reed, she fashioned a crude spear and waded ankle-deep into the shallow water where she'd seen movement. Patience was everything. Insects here moved in pulses, bursts of frenzied activity, then long stillness. After 10 minutes of waiting, she spotted a cluster of shell-backed crawlers near the base of a mossy rock. They reminded her of earth beetles, except their shells shimmered green-blue like oil in sunlight. She jabbed. One missed, another slipped from her grip, but on the third try she skewered 2. She lifted the reed, the creatures wriggling, and carried them back to her makeshift work area. She slit the shells open and drained the fluid into a hollowed-out root she'd saved as a container. The liquid was thick and yellowish, like egg yolk, with a pungent smell. She didn't taste it yet, not without testing it on heat first. Brittany worked in silence for hours, collecting, observing, cataloging. She found a bitter fern that grew in clusters on the side of a tree with bark that left a chalky residue on her fingers. She marked it down. She found a waxy pod that oozed white gel when crushed. When she smeared a tiny amount on her wrist, it cooled the skin instantly. Useful for burns or infections, she guessed. The real breakthrough came just before midday. She knelt to inspect what looked like a fallen branch, but when she poked it, it unfurled. Not a plant, a colony. Dozens of small, pink-bodied larvae curled together in a spiraling nest of mud and silk. She blinked. Larvae meant fat. Fat meant energy. Carefully, she picked up the whole nest with her rope and suspended it from a bent tree branch to avoid damaging the contents. As she stepped back, she heard rustling behind her. She turned and saw one of the Drelna twins, the younger one, Selly, stumbling through the brush, her skin dimmer than usual. The glow that normally shimmered along her translucent limbs had faded to a dull gray. She looked like she hadn't slept or eaten. Her fingers trembled as she tried to speak. "Do you have anything? Anything safe?" Selly's voice was barely more than a whisper. Brittany hesitated. She wasn't ready to share. Not yet, but Selly's condition was worsening fast. Her body chemistry was different from humans, but the signs of metabolic crash were the same. Trembling, shortness of breath, cognitive fog. Brittany pointed to a log and gestured for her to sit. "I have something that might work, but only if you chew slowly and don't swallow the outer shell." She peeled one of the beetles and handed the cleaned interior to Selly, who took it without hesitation and placed it in her mouth. The girl winced at first, then kept chewing. Brittany watched carefully, noting the lack of adverse reaction. No swelling, no discoloration, just a grimace and a slow nod. "I feel better," Selly muttered, wiping her mouth. Brittany gave her a bit of root paste and a few drops of water condensed overnight. It wasn't much, but it stabilized her. Selly stayed seated for a while, silent and dazed. Brittany let her rest. After half an hour, she sent the girl back to the main camp with instructions. "Don't eat anything else today. Don't drink from the swamp. If someone gets sick, don't try to help unless you're sure. And don't tell anyone what I gave you. Not yet." Selly nodded weakly and wandered off through the underbrush. Brittany turned back to her work. She crushed one of the larvae between two stones and sniffed the paste. Nutty, dense, no burning. She touched it to her tongue, slight tingling but no bitter aftertaste. She placed the rest of the larvae into a hollow bark tray she had carved and set it aside. Then she gathered fire-starting materials, dry husks, fibrous roots, and a few flakes of old fungus that sparked when rubbed with flint. Fire wasn't allowed by tech, but friction was primitive. She worked for over an hour, grinding flint and wood together. Sweat poured down her face, blisters formed on her palms. But then, a curl of smoke. She blew gently. Flames caught. She built the fire small and tucked it under a rock overhang to hide the smoke. Then she placed a flat stone over it and smeared the larva paste across the surface. It sizzled, curled, and darkened. The smell wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't awful either. She flipped the paste after a minute, then let it cool on a dry leaf. The result, a thin, dark protein wafer. Chewy, dense, and high in fat and nutrients. She ate half, set the rest aside, and began processing the beetle yolk into a starchy mash with root bits. The next batch she would try to shape. If it worked, she could make something close to a bar, something cadets could carry, ration, and store. Brittany didn't smile. There was no time for celebration, but a quiet confidence settled over her. The swamp wasn't just a test. It was a puzzle. One she was beginning to solve piece by piece, and tomorrow she would build something better. By the third morning, Brittany had already accepted the relentless rhythm of Zaruka 9, the way the swamp pulsed with movement just before sunrise and how the thick air carried distant hisses and whistles that never seemed to repeat. She stood before her fire pit, now nothing more than a blackened hollow ringed by cracked stones, and eyed the soaked remnants of fungus and moss that had smothered it during the night's rain. The flames were gone, but she wasn't discouraged. She had anticipated it. On this planet, nothing lasted without redundancy. She crouched beside a new clearing she had found during her early patrol and rolled out the largest item in her emergency kit, the reflective condensation sheet. While others used it to gather water, she had something else in mind. The sun here didn't rise. It exploded into the sky, blazing through the mist in a searing tri-solar arc that heated even wet soil within minutes. Brittany anchored the sheet on 4 bent branches and angled it toward a dark stone slab she had cleaned earlier. The heat gathered quickly. She could already feel it prickling her skin, even through the shade of her hood. She crushed a fresh batch of root and mashed it together with beetle yolk, the mixture turning into a thick, gummy paste. She had experimented the evening before with different proportions and learned that if she added too much insect matter, the result became chalky and bitter. Too little, and it failed to bind. Now she pressed the new mixture into flat discs about the size of her palm and placed them on the warmed rock under the reflective canopy. The scent that rose was less acrid this time, more earthy, even slightly nutty. She leaned back and watched as the sun baked the protein cakes into firm, bendable wafers. Footsteps crunched through the wet underbrush behind her, deliberate and slow. She turned. Krex approached, his upper limbs folded close to his carapace, a reluctant curiosity in his eyes. He looked better than he had yesterday, less shaky, though still gaunt. His mandibles clicked before he spoke. "I heard. You are making food." Brittany didn't reply immediately. She inspected the discs. The first one was already hardening at the edges, developing the dry skin that kept insects from spoiling quickly. She flipped it with a bark stick and then nodded at Krex. "Yes, not for trade, but if someone's collapsing again, I'll help." Krex sat without asking. The motion was stiff but not hostile. His gaze drifted to her setup. The reflectors, the crude tray, the piles of insect shells sorted into edible and toxic. "I watched others yesterday. A grelin tried to eat the blue leaf vine and had to be evacuated. The twins are still shivering. The Sarnari have stopped moving entirely." "I know," she said, breaking a dried cake in half and tasting a piece. It crunched cleanly, no foul aftertaste, no bitter grit. "They're scared of failing, but failing's not the worst thing. Giving up thinking is worse." He tilted his head, antennae twitching. "You don't care about your ranking?" "I do," she replied, "but not more than living." Krex fell silent. The air between them thickened with heat and spores. Brittany passed him one of the discs. He sniffed it with caution, then used his lower mandibles to scrape a piece into his mouth. After a few tense seconds, he made a low, chittering sound. Satisfaction, or at least relief. "You call this a bar?" "It's a start. I can improve it. You should hide this. Others will come. Hungry ones." She nodded. "Let them. But I won't hand it out. I'll teach. That's the difference." Krex stood again, this time with less hesitation. He scanned the tree line before stepping back into the thick reeds. By midday, Brittany had created 8 more discs and stored them in a leaf-wrapped pouch slung from a low branch. She had learned that wrapping them before sunset kept the moisture out. Every movement was now part of a system. Gather, prep, press, cook, cool, store. Her process was crude, but it worked. The hardest part wasn't the insects or the roots. It was knowing when to stop collecting and start sharing. Near the 4th hour, another visitor emerged. This time it was Zarin, a cadet from the Unari cluster, humanoid in shape but covered in a semi-translucent membrane that shimmered blue-green in the light. He carried nothing. His face was pale. His fingers twitched with fatigue. He approached without speaking, then knelt awkwardly, eyes never leaving her pouch of discs. "Hungry?" she asked. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. She pulled one from the pouch and handed it to him. He didn't hesitate. The first bite almost choked him, but he chewed through it, then looked up at her with watery eyes. "I can't tell you what's in it," she said. "You won't want to know, but it's clean. I've eaten 10. I trust you," he muttered. "Saw what you did. Watched you make fire." She raised her brow. "From where?" "The ridge. I went up last night. Couldn't sleep. You were the only one doing anything smart. Everyone else just complains." Brittany felt something shift in her chest. It wasn't pride, exactly. It was recognition. Someone else had been paying attention. She nodded. "Want to learn?" "Yes," he whispered. "I need to. I don't want to depend." She handed him a second disc and pointed at the layout of her station. "Then start here. Clean your hands with this bark. Use that scraper. Don't touch the black shells. Those are toxic. Don't mix fresh root with stored beetle. It spoils faster." For the rest of the afternoon, Zarin followed her instructions precisely. He fumbled often but recovered quickly. He didn't ask questions, just observed, absorbed, and copied. By evening, he managed to shape his first disc. It cracked at the edge, but it held. She let him keep it. That night, the wind over the swamp changed direction. The spores that usually rose after sunset instead drifted low across the camp, settling in clusters near the cadet shelters. Brittany stayed in her own cleared area, watching from a distance as several cadets stumbled out, coughing or complaining about the air. She had chosen her camp location carefully, slightly uphill, away from standing water, with trees that didn't drop irritating pollen. Zarin returned after sunset and sat with her in silence. Krex arrived shortly after, this time bringing 3 insects skewered on a carved reed. He handed them to her wordlessly and sat down. None of them said anything for a long while. The swamp gurgled. A chorus of clicking rose from somewhere deep in the underbrush. Then Zarin spoke. "Tomorrow, we teach?" Brittany nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, but only those who are willing to learn, not those looking for a free handout." Krex murmured, "Then it will be a small class." She smirked. "That's fine. Fewer hands touching the food." The 3 of them sat together until the moons of Zaruka 9 began to rise. Brittany had started alone, but now, for the first time since the drop, she didn't feel like she was surviving in isolation. She was building something, and it was only just beginning. By the 4th morning, the makeshift camp had changed. Brittany noticed it immediately as she climbed from her bed of woven reeds and bark. The air was still thick, and the fungus spores clung to her sleeves like ash. But something in the atmosphere had shifted, not just in the air, but among the cadets themselves. She could feel it in the silence. There was less coughing, less whimpering, more movement, quiet, focused movement. She pulled her knife from her belt and began slicing fresh root along the flat stone table she had polished over the last few days. Zarin arrived not long after, his hands wrapped in thick leaves for carrying scavenged larvae. Krex followed with a curved stick full of de-shelled crawlers, their flesh gleaming like amber. Neither of them spoke. Brittany didn't expect them to. The rhythm had been set. She handed Zarin the scraper and nodded toward the mixing bowl fashioned from hardened bark. 2 scoops of ground root, 1 scoop yolk. Stir until it sticks to the blade. He nodded and began the process. His movements were smoother now, more confident. He no longer glanced at her for approval. He simply worked. Krex sat beside the solar tray and aligned the reflective canopy. He adjusted the angle by instinct, compensating for the new position of the suns. Brittany was quietly impressed. The real test came when the first group arrived. The Drelna twins stepped through the trees, their skin brighter than before, but still dull compared to their usual glow. Selly looked stronger. Her sister, Aura, kept her chin low, her fingers twitching from nerves. Behind them followed 3 more cadets, 2 from the crystalline-fleshed Larian species, and 1 tall, hulking figure Brittany recognized as a Korak brute named Rusk. All of them carried nothing. All of them had the same expression, worn, hungry, uncertain. Brittany straightened. Zarin and Krex stopped working. Aura stepped forward. We saw the others. We saw Zarin cook. We saw Krex bring food back. Someone told us you helped. Please. We want to learn, not just eat. Brittany watched them carefully. The Korak cadet kept his gaze on the ground. He wasn't used to asking for help. Brittany respected that struggle. She looked back at her tray. Only 4 discs were ready, not enough for 7 mouths. "You're late," she said firmly. "We started hours ago." Aura nodded, her hands clasped in front of her. "We'll catch up. Just tell us where to start." Brittany stepped aside. "Krex, teach the fire shelter. Zarin, assign gathering zones. Keep them away from the Blackroot Grove and the Acid Pond. Aura and her sister can help me prep." She watched as Krex motioned the larger cadets toward the shaded slope where the fire pit lay half dug and covered in stone. Zarin handed each new arrival a different tool or improvised bag. There was no hesitation, no arguing. The system was working. Throughout the afternoon, the sound of chopping, scraping, grinding, and occasional groans of exertion filled the clearing. Brittany worked with Selly and Aura to refine the mixing process. The twins had delicate fingers, ideal for pressing and shaping the cakes evenly. Brittany taught them how to recognize the subtle signs of spoilage, the wrong smell, the wrong color, the way a mash curled instead of flattening. Around mid-cycle, Rusk returned with a pouch full of yellow beetles, his thick hands trembling as he dumped them onto the prep stone. "These okay?" he asked, voice low. Brittany examined them. The shells looked soft, the legs intact, no green bands along the spine. That was a good sign. "Good catch. Remove the heads, save the yolk, don't crack the midsection, that's where the bile sits." He nodded and kneeled, fumbling a little with the scraper, but Brittany didn't correct him. She let him figure it out. She understood that dignity came not from being spared effort, but from being allowed to rise through it. By the time the suns began to drop toward the horizon, the camp had produced over 20 bars. Brittany laid them out along a vine-drying rack she had built from branches, using a light layer of fine dust to coat the exterior. It kept insects away. She watched the others lean in to examine the row of handmade rations. For some, it was the first time they had seen real, edible structure since the drop. Then came the question she had anticipated. Sally turned to her and asked softly, "Do we give these out, or do we keep them?" Brittany glanced around. No one else spoke. The weight of the answer hung in the air. "We eat what we make," she said slowly. "If someone wants a bar, they contribute. A root, a handful of larvae, even a clean tool. No handouts, no currency, only effort." Zarin nodded first, then Krex. Rusk grunted and stood beside the drying rack, arms crossed, silent but ready. That evening, a procession began. One by one, cadets from the outer camps arrived. Some brought offerings. Leaf bundles, bark bowls, scavenged roots. Others came empty-handed, eyes sunken, bellies rumbling. Brittany didn't turn anyone away immediately. She listened, asked questions, tested each one. Those who could offer something, even labor, were accepted. Those who only begged were told to come back when they had something of value. No one protested. Not one. By nightfall, the clearing had turned into a true feeding circle. The fire pit glowed with steady heat. The drying rack was refilled twice. Cadets rotated through stations, gatherers, preparers, cooks, and guards. Brittany oversaw everything, but she didn't micromanage. She let the system evolve. She watched others teach what she had taught. She watched new eyes light up with understanding. And she realized something deeper was forming. Not just survival, not just structure. Trust. When the moons rose and the swamp cooled, Brittany sat near the fire, a finished bar in her hand. Zarin sat across from her, chewing quietly. Krex was asleep against a tree, his arms wrapped around his tool pouch. The Drelna twins whispered back and forth as they arranged new tools made from folded reeds and beetle shells. Rusk stood silently at the edge of the clearing, his eyes scanning the dark tree line for movement. Brittany bit into the bar and felt the warmth settle in her stomach. It wasn't just food anymore. It was resilience in physical form. For the first time since arriving, she felt full, not just in body, but in purpose. The circle was working, and by tomorrow it would grow again. The sun had barely crested over the fungal towers when Brittany stepped out from beneath the lean-to and inhaled the early air. It was different this time. Clearer, thinner, no longer stifled by the constant haze of worry and hunger. Her body ached from days of motion and rough sleep, but she moved with purpose. The feeding circle was already awake. Krex was crouched by the bark filter basin, refining the water extraction method by layering fine root fibers to strain sediment. Zarin stood at the tool station, tying a fresh scraper blade with vine cord to a curved bone handle. The Drelna twins were mixing yolk and starch with a level of rhythm that almost resembled music. The clink of stone bowls, the low thud of root mash, the occasional laughter, the sound of a system not just functioning but thriving. Brittany watched it unfold for several minutes before joining in. She had no desire to disrupt what had naturally formed. Her role had shifted. She was still a leader, but no longer the sole mind behind the operation. The knowledge had transferred. The initiative had spread, and most of all, the fear had dissipated. Around midday, the atmosphere changed. A low hum vibrated through the soil, mechanical, precise, unmistakable. Brittany froze mid-movement. Krex dropped the shell he was polishing. Zarin looked to the sky. The hum grew louder, and then the shuttle appeared, descending through the fog like a predator coming to roost. Its undercarriage glinted, sleek and black, reflecting the suns above. Brittany narrowed her eyes. The instructors had returned. The shuttle landed with a hiss, kicking up dust and spores. The ramp lowered and a cluster of figures emerged. Two humanoid supervisors in polished exogear, a Larian observer wrapped in a floating translator membrane, and behind them, the head evaluator of the simulation unit, Commander Vexen. Vexen was known throughout the Academy as a brilliant tactician and a ruthless grader. He wore a drab gray uniform and an expression that made ice feel warm. His gaze swept the camp with calculated disapproval before he even spoke. No fatalities, no evacuations in the last 36 hours, no emergency signal dispatches. Curious. Brittany stepped forward, her posture calm, her hands behind her back. We stabilized the group. Vexen's eyes locked onto hers. You are Cadet Brittany Collins. Human. Earth origin. Yes, sir. He raised one brow. You were not assigned leadership. No, sir. I simply didn't want to starve. Behind him, the Larian observer floated forward and extended a probe toward one of the food bars drying on the rack. It pulsed a soft blue as it scanned the contents, then emitted a chirp. The translation band around her midsection lit up. Stable, non-toxic, balanced protein-to-fat ratio, sustainable for at least 5 days without degradation. Vexen didn't react. He stepped toward the center of the camp and motioned for a full report. Krex approached with a ledger scrawled onto palm leaves using plant dye. Zarin handed over a bark model of the camp layout. Brittany remained still. The evaluation took an hour. Cadets were called forward one by one. Each described the roles they had assumed, the processes used, the errors corrected. Brittany noticed something remarkable. None of them mentioned her by name as the sole solution. They spoke of systems, of shared knowledge, of how she had taught them to teach others. The recognition was there, but it was not worship. It was respect. When the interviews ended, Vexen returned to the center of the clearing. His expression remained unreadable. His voice, however, had shifted, less cold, more analytical. Most groups fail Protocol 7 within 48 hours. This cohort did not. This cohort exceeded projections. This cohort developed a repeatable, adaptable nutritional economy using zero tech and zero outside intervention. He paused, then added, That has not occurred in 5 years. The cadet stiffened slightly. Even Rusk, the quietest of them, clenched his jaw. Vexen turned to Brittany. You rewrote the survival metric, not with tools, not with brute force, with intuition, persistence, and most of all, transference. You did not hoard, you educated. You established continuity. Brittany said nothing. She knew a trap when she heard one. Praise from Vexen often preceded a lecture. He surprised her. That, he said, is leadership. The other instructors murmured in agreement. The Larian observer nodded once and floated back toward the shuttle. Brittany stood still, unsure what was expected next. Then Vexen did something no one anticipated. He stepped closer, removed a small metal insignia from a pouch on his belt, and placed it in her hand. It was a simple badge, triangular, bearing the Academy's crest. But this one was black, not silver. Rare. Reserved only for field innovations that shifted Academy policy. This will be recorded in the archives as a benchmark, he said. Effective immediately, components of your method will be integrated into Phase 1 training simulations. Brittany felt the weight of the badge in her palm. It wasn't heavy, but the meaning pressed hard. Thank you, sir. Vexen turned back toward the shuttle without another word. The evaluators followed. The ramp closed behind them, and the ship lifted into the sky, vanishing beyond the fungal towers. Silence fell again, not from fear, but from processing. When Brittany finally looked up, the cadets were staring at her, not clapping, not cheering, but nodding. Zarin smiled faintly. Krex tilted his head in approval. Selly wiped her eyes and returned to her mixing bowl without speaking. The rhythm resumed. The camp exhaled. That night, as the moons hung low over the swamp, Brittany sat alone by the fire. She turned the badge in her fingers, watching it catch the flicker of flame. She could leave now if she wanted. She had completed the challenge. She had earned her place